I've become increasingly aware through my life. Partly this is through teaching at a university. I have a job 3 days a week as a psychologist at university, Leeds Beckett University in Yorkshire. And if you work in academia, you become aware that there's a certain paradigm, a certain belief system almost, which kind of underpins academia. And it's a very skeptical belief system. Just to illustrate this, I was speaking to one of my colleagues in the staff room a while ago. He's a sociologist, my colleague. And he said to me, I don't know why, he'd been writing about religion. He said, what do you think about religion? Why do people still believe this nonsense? And why do some people still believe in life after death? And I said, well, you've got to be careful there, because I personally, I'm a rational person, I'm an academic, but I'm open to the possibility of some form of life after death. And he was like really shocked. He said, what? There's kind of like an implication that if you're an academic, and if you're a rational scientist even, then you shouldn't have these superstitious beliefs in life after death, or you shouldn't accept that psi phenomena like telepathy and precognition possibly exist. And you shouldn't believe that near-death experiences or spiritual experiences are really anything more than a hallucination produced by brain activity, aberrational brain activity. So even though I'm an academic, I'm very skeptical about this belief system, this paradigm. You could call it the materialist paradigm, which underpins academia. And it runs through our whole educational system. Our school systems are based on this paradigm as well. I can remember when I was 18 years old, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to go to a talk about meditation at the local library. And I didn't know what meditation was. I thought maybe, well, does that mean like deep thinking? Something like that. So I went along anyway, and it was a talk about TM, transcendental meditation. And the speaker, I remember he said things like, when you meditate, you gain access to the blissful consciousness which is your nature. I remember thinking, what a load of nonsense. What's he talking about? And he said things like, by meditating, you deepen your awareness and tune into your essential nature of spirit. I thought, what a load of nonsense. What's he talking about? Because from my school days, and also through my upbringing, through my parents, I'd absorbed the materialist paradigm. I remember thinking, what's he talking about? Consciousness, blissful consciousness. What does that mean? Surely I'm just a brain with brain cells and molecules. Surely I'm just made up of genes, and what more is there? But of course, when I did sit down to meditate, a year or two later, I realized he was right, that there is this quality of consciousness within us, and that consciousness does have a blissful nature. And you can gain access to deep aspects of your own being through meditation. But I sort of unthinkingly absorbed this materialist paradigm. And I think our whole culture unthinkingly accepts this paradigm. There are little pockets of esotericism, like here in this bookshop. There are little groups who are interested in spirituality. Oh, there are many groups who are interested in spirituality, but the mainstream paradigm of our culture is materialism. And the interesting thing is that a lot of materialists, a lot of scientists, don't actually realize that they have this paradigm. They think it's just objective reality. And they don't actually realize that they have absorbed a certain belief system. And in my book, I suggest that this belief system is made up of assumptions, just like any religion. It's made up of certain tenets and assumptions about reality. So a couple of the standard tenets of materialism are that consciousness is just produced by the brain, and our mental activity is just a reflection of neurological activity. Another assumption is that when the brain dies, our consciousness also ends. So there is no life after death. There can't be any life after death, because consciousness is just produced by the brain. So when the brain dies, consciousness also dies. And also another tenet is that psi phenomena like precognition or telepathy cannot exist, because they allegedly contravene the laws of physics. But if you look into it, all of these assumptions are just assumptions. There's actually no evidence of them. There's no evidence that consciousness is produced by brain activity. And in fact, if you look into it, there's actually a lot of evidence which contradicts that idea. And I'll go into that in a short while. And I became very aware of this belief system just a few months ago, actually last summer. I was invited to speak at a festival called the Blue Dot Festival, which is billed as a science and music festival, about 20 miles outside Manchester, where I live. And it was very interesting. A lot of eminent scientists were speaking at this festival, and it was very interesting to hear their views. But throughout the whole festival, I was aware of this belief system. And there was actually a talk by Richard Dawkins at this festival. And I went along, and again, throughout his whole presentation, there was this assumption that life is basically purposeless, that human beings are basically genetic machines, that the universe is basically a giant machine with no meaning. There's this sort of assumption of meaninglessness and purposelessness and mechanistic, it's a very mechanistic way of perceiving the world. And at the end of Richard Dawkins' presentation, somebody put their hand up and said, "Richard, don't you think that, couldn't we say that religion tells us one story about reality and science tells us another story about reality?" And Richard Dawkins scowled at this guy and said, "Bollocks." That's literally all he said. That was the extent of his answer. So you could compare that to a fundamentalist Christian or Muslim. When their views are questioned, they react with this kind of aggressive, in this aggressive spirit. And I might try that later when some of you ask me some questions. But it's quite an effective way of dealing with questions that you don't want to answer. So this materialist worldview, which I question in my book, I suggest that it's had very serious, very detrimental cultural effects. It's created a sense of nihilism in our culture, a sense of meaninglessness. And it's also created a very hostile attitude to nature, because it encourages us to think of the natural world as a kind of machine. Living beings, we think of living beings as objects, which we are entitled to exploit and use for our own devices. But the biggest area in which this worldview is deficient is in that it doesn't actually explain the world very well. There are so many different aspects of human behavior and so many different aspects of the world itself which cannot be explained in materialistic terms. So as a way of explaining the world, materialism doesn't actually work at all. Consciousness cannot be explained in materialistic terms. The influence of the mind over the body cannot be explained in materialistic terms. Things like the placebo effect, or the healing which can take place under hypnosis, for example. Those cannot be explained in materialistic terms. And also something like altruism it's very difficult to explain in materialistic terms. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And when you move into anomalous phenomena like psi phenomena, near-death experiences, spiritual experiences, materialism can only deal with these phenomena by saying that they don't really exist. It disregards them or explains them away as as hallucinations, but as a way of explaining the world. So I put forward an alternative, and I call my alternative pan-spiritism. That's the name I've devised for my philosophy, panspiritism. And it's similar. Has anybody heard of panpsychism? It's similar to panpsychism, but at the same time slightly different. Panpsychism suggests that all material particles have a tiny bit of consciousness in them. It suggests that all material things are slightly conscious to some infinitesimally small degree. But that's just material things. I suggest that actually the whole universe is conscious. I suggest that there is a fundamental consciousness, or spirit you could call it, which pervades the whole of reality. I suggest that fundamental consciousness is actually the origin of the universe of matter that we know actually emerged from fundamental consciousness or spirit, you could say. So as a result, everything around us, the space in which we live, the space which fills the Earth's atmosphere, and also the space inside us within our beings, and all objects around us, all books, all carpets, all lights, cash registers, anything, everything is pervaded with consciousness, because consciousness is a fundamental thing in the universe. And this is actually quite similar to the view of the world which a lot of the world's indigenous peoples had. Like Native Americans talked about the Great Spirit, the Great Mystery. And when I wrote a book called The Fall, which was published in 2005, I did a lot of research about the world's indigenous groups, and I found that practically every single group had some concept of an all-pervading spiritual force, some kind of universal energy, a soul force of some kind. So pan-spiritism is essentially the same idea, that there is an all-pervading spiritual energy or force in everything, pervading all the space around us, pervading everything in the universe. And I suggest that if you make this principle, this spiritual principle, the foundation of science, then actually the world begins to make a lot more sense. A lot of the things which can't be explained in terms of the standard scientific model become easily explainable in pan-spiritist terms, in spiritual terms, you could say. So I'll give you one example, and I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a second just to illustrate this example. So just relax for a moment, switch into your meditative posture if you have one. And just for 1 second, I'd like you to close your eyes. With your eyes closed, I'd just like you to be aware for a moment of your own consciousness. Just be aware of any thoughts that arise in your mind while you're listening to me now. Any associations that arise, any thoughts about what happened to you today, or what's going to happen later, what's happening now. And just watch those associations pass by, almost as if you're sitting on a riverbank watching a stream or a river flow by. Just be aware of those thoughts arising, passing by, and fading away. And also be aware that there is a point or a place inside you from which you are watching those thoughts. There's a point of stillness within you where you can observe your own thoughts passing by. And also from which you can observe, or with which you are aware of sights and sounds and smells and any sensory phenomena outside you. So just be aware of that point of stillness inside you. And also, just be aware of any sounds you can hear outside you, besides my voice. Be aware of the light that you can see even though your eyes are closed. Just feel that light streaming through your eyelids. Be aware of your body as well, sitting on the chair, your feet on the ground. Maybe you can sense that you are aware of these sounds and these feelings from a point of stillness inside you, from a point of pure awareness inside you. Let's slowly open our eyes again. I was encouraging you to experience your own consciousness there. So thoughts and associations are part of your conscious experience. Also that sense of being somebody, this sense of a point of stillness within your consciousness, that's part of your consciousness too, obviously. And also your awareness of your surroundings, your awareness of sounds and sights and smells is also part of your conscious experience. But one big issue, one big question, which has preoccupied scientists for about 30 years now, is where does consciousness come from? Is consciousness just produced by the brain? And most scientists have assumed that consciousness is produced by the brain, that in some way all of the neural networks within your brain work together to produce your thoughts, your sense of being somebody. And so basically consciousness is just a product of brain activity. That was the assumption, but after 30 years, nobody has come anywhere near suggesting how the brain could produce consciousness. Nobody has identified which parts of the brain are even associated with consciousness. And there were lots of difficulties in associating the brain with consciousness. For example, one difficulty is that in some way, that in many experiences or situations, less brain activity actually equates with more intense consciousness. There are many cases of people in deep comas who experience very intense consciousness even though there is very little neurological activity. There are even cases of people missing massive amounts of brain tissue and yet still being normally conscious and being able to live a normal life. There was one French guy in 2007, he had a brain scan for the first time in his life. And he was a civil servant, married with 2 kids, and the brain scan discovered that he actually had 75% of his brain tissue missing. There was a giant hole inside of his head, just an empty space inside his head. And all his brain tissue was pushed towards the edges of his brain. But even then, he had only 25% of normal brain matter. And yet, he was still apparently, a normal person, able to work and raise a family. So there's the kind of mismatch between brain activity and consciousness. And we can see that really clearly in near-death experiences. There are many attested examples of near-death experiences where people, apparently their brain ceases to function, they become effectively dead for a short time, and yet their consciousness continues, and they have very rich and very intense conscious experiences, even to the point of witnessing events which occur while their brain is effectively dead. There was a really great book published, I don't know if this book is here, it's called The Self Does Not Die. Does anybody know that book? It was a collection of what are called veridical perceptions that occur during near-death experiences when people witness real events and cases where the events have been investigated, and a lot of very, very interesting stories and cases. So I don't think you can explain consciousness. The consciousness you experience then, I don't think you can explain that in terms of brain activity. I think there's obviously an association between consciousness and brain activity, but the source of consciousness is actually somewhere else. And I think the source of consciousness is spirit. I think the source of our consciousness is the fundamental consciousness which fills the universe. I think that our brains don't actually produce consciousness, they transmit consciousness. The consciousness exists outside us as a fundamental thing in the universe, and our brains work to transmit or canalize that consciousness into our individual beings. That makes much more sense to me. And of course, that idea is it has quite a long tradition, going back to William James over 100 years ago. He was the first person to suggest the transmission theory of consciousness. And actually a lot of theorists and philosophers are coming back to these kinds of more esoteric ideas of consciousness, now that it's becoming more and more evident that consciousness cannot be explained in terms of brain activity. More and more philosophers and scientists are turning towards panpsychism, or what I call Panspiritism. So I'm going to give you just a very brief second activity now, and this is to illustrate altruism. A lot of scientists are quite skeptical about altruism. Nobody denies that altruism exists, but people have differing opinions about the origins of altruism or the motives of altruism. So what I'd like you to do is to speak to the person next to you for a moment and tell them, give an example of an altruistic activity that you did recently. For example, helping a friend, lending money, whatever it may be, saving a spider. This is my one, saving a spider from death in the shower by scooping it out of the shower and sending it off to freedom instead of drowning it in my shower. That's my latest example, I think. Okay, so just literally for 1 or 2 minutes, just tell the person next to you an example of altruism from your own life.
You've never done any charity work?
I've done loads.
Yeah, you have done
I
loads.
just said that to make you laugh. What does kindness mean? What's all that?
Altruism is when you do something and you don't expect something in return.
Well, I'm thinking about when you're generous. It doesn't really matter what your motive is, just you act in a generous way or a kind way. Yeah. Let's bring that activity to a close. Let me take a couple of examples to lift our spirits. Let's have some examples of altruistic acts. Anybody like to?
I'm a part-time altruist, unfortunately. I did. I think it was it's a day called Giving Tuesday, is it? After Cyber Monday, when everyone goes off and spends load, and Black Friday and all that stuff. And I just bought a basket of food for an elderly lady in the local Sainsbury's. And I was just saying to my person here that it actually probably made me feel better than she did. She got £10 free and and went home and thought, oh, the world's maybe not as bleak. But for me, I felt good about it. And what struck me was that it was very easy gesture to do. If you could, it's not always about paying for something, but it was just a way of, a random act of kindness, I guess. Not so random, it was actually quite contrived from my perspective, but I'd like to think it was right.
Right, thank you. Well, what I would encourage you to think about, I guess that's what you were touching on anyway, is the motivation of altruism. What is our motivation when we act generously or kindly? Well, that's altruism is difficult to account for in materialistic terms, because if we are just genetic machines, if the only real purpose of our lives is to survive and reproduce, then altruism doesn't make much sense. Maybe it makes sense if we are altruistic towards people who are closely related to us genetically, because we're actually helping our own genes. But what about when I help a spider? I'm not genetically related to spiders, obviously. I hope not. But and what happens when you help somebody who's not closely related to you, a stranger, a member of a different ethnic group, or whatever? Where is the genetic motive there? There is no genetic motive. So, you have to account for altruism in other ways. So the standard explanation is it's egoic altruism. It's disguised selfishness. Maybe you want to look good in the eyes of your neighbours, or even in the eyes of yourself. You want to think, oh, I'm a good person after all. And then you can sort of strike off all those bad deeds you did in the past because you are a good person. I'm not talking about you personally, obviously. But you are a good person after all. So there's some sort of selfish motive, because altruism does not make any sense in materialistic terms and genetic terms. But I think that's nonsense. I think if you accept that we do share the same essential being or consciousness, then altruism makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm sure there are egoic motives too, there are selfish motives sometimes, but there's also pure altruism, which is when I can sense another person's suffering because I share the same being as them. So I can sense your suffering because I'm part of you, you're part of me. And therefore, I feel an impulse to alleviate your suffering, just as I would try to alleviate my own suffering. I feel the same impulse towards you, because essentially I am you. We are part of the same network. So I think that is the essential impulse which gives rise to altruism. In a way, it is selfish, but it's a different self. It's like a transpersonal self. It's a self which belongs to everybody. It's not an individual self. So I would say that altruism makes sense in spiritual terms. But this isn't. It also applies to other phenomena like telepathy. As I said before, telepathy makes no sense in materialistic terms. And it really makes me not angry. It surprises me that there is actually a lot of empirical evidence for telepathy. There are so many experiments which have very significant positive results. The Ganzfeld experiments and so on, precognition experiments, pre-sentiment. They're really rigorously conducted scientific experiments. But it never seems to convince skeptics that it's, that there is something going on. And it's because it does contravene the belief system of materialism. But again, if you forget the materialist paradigm and if you accept that there is a shared consciousness which we all participate in, then it makes complete sense that sometimes, under certain circumstances, we can pick up on each other's intentions, especially people who are emotionally close to us. We pick up on their thoughts, we pick up on their intentions. It's natural because, you know, we are not separate. And also spiritual experiences. Spiritual experiences are sometimes explained as neurological abnormalities, different activity in the parts of the brain that are responsible for creating boundaries and so forth. But those, again, these materialistic interpretations don't really work. And, you know, you can see the best way of seeing spiritual experiences of oneness and bliss and so forth is as an encounter with the fundamental spirit, an encounter with fundamental consciousness. That's why in deep states of meditation, when our minds become very, very quiet, we have this sense of oneness, we have this sense of connecting to something bigger than ourselves. We have a sense that somehow we're touching into something fundamental, something essential. And that is exactly what we're doing. We're touching into the fundamental consciousness which pervades the whole universe. So we can do that in meditation, when we journey, when we embark on an inner journey into our own deeper being. But we can also do that outwardly. You know, if you're in the countryside on a beautiful day, suddenly you have this sense that, wow, I feel connected to everything around me. And somehow everything around me seems to be one, it seems to be interconnected. Everything seems to be the expression of something more fundamental. And again, that's exactly what we're experiencing. That's exactly what is happening. We're touching into, we're becoming aware of the fundamental oneness of all things as expressions of spirit or fundamental consciousness. So that's basically what I do in the book. I go through all of these different areas of anomalous experiences, and also areas like evolution. I try to show that the standard view of evolution does not work, and you have to have a more spiritual explanation of evolution for it to make sense. And another thing I try to do in the book is to show that even within science itself, a lot of the standard ideas are being overhauled and transcended. Because there are a lot of new findings in science which suggest that the world is much more complex and mysterious than scientists used to believe. Even in evolution, a lot of biologists are rejecting the standard model of evolution because it can't explain the sheer variety and creativity of life forms on this planet. So there is a movement within science to transcend the materialistic paradigm. There's a new area of science called quantum biology. Anybody heard of quantum biology? It's a really interesting area where, and it's not esoteric, it's very mainstream, but it's where the findings of quantum physics are being applied to a lot of strange biological phenomena, like photosynthesis, or the migration of birds. Lots of strange phenomena which don't seem to make sense in terms of the standard model. So people are saying that the weird quantum effects where particles can appear in different positions, where particles are entangled, so even if they're miles apart, they can still move in tandem. They seem to be somehow aware of each other. Scientists are suggesting that these weird quantum phenomena actually take place in the world around us. So there is this movement towards a less mechanistic model of reality. And, and I don't think this is just an academic matter. I don't think it's just a question of people arguing about different interpretations of reality. It's not just a question of a few philosophers in an ivory tower arguing about the nature of being. I think these issues are actually critical to our whole culture, maybe even critical to the survival of our species. I think the consequences of materialism have manifested themselves in a number of crises and potential catastrophes, including the ecological catastrophe, which may be, already underway. I think these problems we're facing as a species are a consequence of the materialistic paradigm. and that we have to develop a new way of viewing the world, a new way of experiencing the world, in order to survive as a species. We have to move into a different paradigm which transcends separateness and which transcends the mechanistic view of reality. And we have to become able to experience our fundamental connectedness, our fundamental oneness with all things. That will enable us to treat other living beings with respect, as a lot of indigenous groups used to do, because they sense that they were part of their being. And it will enable us to treat each other with respect, rather than, exploiting and oppressing different groups. And it will enable us to live in harmony with the world, rather than living in opposition to the world. And it will enable us to live a life of ease and contentment, rather than a life of suffering and discord. So the book really represents an optimistic vision of the future, and I try to suggest a path through which we can move towards this harmonious future. Thank you very much. Yeah, because there is the suggestion that the world is somehow inherently evil, the material world.
Yeah, the reason it's
But I don't, that's not the way I experience things. My experience is that the world is fundamentally benevolent, fundamentally positive.
Animals eating each other alive. It's very cruel, the animal kingdom.
It can be, yeah, but I don't think a lot of animals are vegetarians, Yeah, I mean, there's this kind of idea that even within the human race, there's this idea that human life has always been a struggle, a competitive struggle, that human groups have always been fighting against each other, trying to exterminate each other. But it's a myth. There was actually a really good article in Scientific American 2 months ago, which was summarising the evidence that warfare is actually a very recent phenomenon, and that until about 7,000 years ago, human groups lived without warfare. And hunter-gatherer groups, even nowadays, are egalitarian. They have egalitarian principles, non-hierarchical, non-authoritarian.
It's the capitalist system.
Well, it was something changed. I wrote about it in my book, The Fall. I suggested there was a psychological change, the fall into ego-separateness and individualism. So, yeah, something changed.
Do you address the aura in your book?
No, not in this book. I did touch on it in one of my other books called Waking from Sleep, in connection with spiritually awakened individuals. They seem to have a certain radiance around them, which is very attractive to people, which transmits a sense of stillness to people around them. Rupert Sheldrake's done some really interesting experiments on animal telepathy.
Yeah.
Even when human beings having a sense of orientation towards home. But these experiments, in most cases, they've already been done, but they've just not been accepted by conventional science. Like I said before, conventional science tends to disregard or deny anything which contravenes its principles, just like religions used to do, or still do. It's like, say, Christians saying that fossils are not really millions of years old, they were created 4,000 years ago by God as a kind of test, or by the devil to tempt us into disbelief. So you just deny phenomena which don't fit into your worldview. And, so I think the evidence is already there.
I'm always surprised we're not much more telepathic than it was, amazes me that we haven't got much more telepathic powers than we...
Yeah.
What you were saying reminded me like the Star Wars Jedi philosophy, but surely that's just, may the Force be with you, tuning into the...
Kind of concept of a fundamental spiritual force is the Tao in Chinese philosophy, Brahman in Indian philosophy, in the Kabbalah it's Ein Sof.
Yeah. But surely all the particle physicists and stuff, everything's now so theoretical, it's all energies, and they can't prove anything because the experiments just can't be done. And also with
a lot of it is very
so
speculative,
esoteric, and you'd have thought most scientists would say, we just don't know. We are so ignorant about everything.
Yeah, well, I think more and more scientists are coming around to that perspective. Quite a lot of physicists, even quantum physicists, don't ponder over the implications. They just say, do the math. Ignore the philosophy, just do the calculations. So you get somebody like Brian Cox, who's a quantum physicist, but he's basically essentially a materialist. He doesn't really consider the implications of his own findings.
Very nice.
Yeah. Yeah.